we are going to talk a little bit about, I mean, I should say first of all that this is a sort of, feels like it's a very 2020 kind of cultural project. It's like a mixture of a deeply serious project about the future of the whole of architecture and also an internet meme at the same time, which feels to me like the cultural predicament that we're in at the moment. We're going to talk a little bit about ourselves because none of you know who we are, or apart from those of you who are our friends who've been invited especially. And we're also going to talk, kind of give some context, talk about some methods of mapping the future that we use. We're going to talk about a project that we've done with it, and all of that shouldn't take very long. And then we're all going to embark on this experimental co-design project together at the end. And on screen, there's this sign-up link as well, if you can see it, and we'll refresh all of this at the end. If anyone new has,
or in the middle,
at that point. Yeah, we can do that as well. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we should jump into it. We appreciate it. Thanks very much for joining us and giving up essentially like a remote lunchtime here potentially. And we really want this to be kind of as fun as open as possible. So the first bit of this is going to be relatively quick, we hope, and we'll jump into the second part. But I think we should probably leap into it.
Okay, shall I go?
Yeah. Okay, so a little bit of introduction about Heat Island, which is we're kind of architecture and design collective based in London. We're kind of interested in obviously architecture and buildings. We're also interested in the kind of space of possibilities that make architecture possible. And for us, that's a lot about like the systems and infrastructure behind it. So a lot of the work we've done has focused around the kind of infrastructures and footprints of architectural systems. We've done built work and kind of research projects, but I think at the heart of it at the moment is the kind of ongoing project for ourselves is to reimagine a little bit, or think about how we might reorganize the idea of collectively working together and what that looks like for architecture. And today we're going to be presenting this project Deep House. This presentation is kind of in 3 parts, which I guess is a little bit of a callback to architecture education. We hope the third part isn't the most boring. But the first part is basically the context of this project and a little bit of the methodology, kind of quote unquote, that we've been developing, kind of the things we're researching. Second part is this project, which was developed for an exhibition in Milan. And then the third part is this exercise in mapping. And we're hoping that is the launching off point for this kind of like a conversation about the methodology or research generally. And we also want to kind of collect the way that we are talking about these issues in this map that we might build. So we should jump in, I think. The context for this project is really this question of decarbonisation and architecture, and being interested in the relationship between these 2 things and trying to unpick it a bit. There's going to be a handful of graphs in the first section, and I apologise, but for me this is the most important one. This is the range of atmospheric kind of concentrations of carbon, like the range of uncertainty produced by the IPCC. It's kind of useful to understand what the potential temperature ranges and kind of carbon amounts in the atmosphere will be. But for us, there's this kind of secondary thing here, which is that as we can think of it as a kind of space in which future projects happen. And you could even kind of suggest that all projects we will ever work on will take place somewhere in this space of possibility, this uncertainty. And in that sense, like all architecture is in a sense of a project of futurology connected to navigating this kind of range of uncertainty. But there's this double whammy that, of course, architecture then, in some small way, will also produce these outcomes. It will kind of steer us towards one of these paths. And this, for us, is a kind of question we've been really trying to tap into, what the feedback of this is and what the kind of architectural systems we need to develop to kind of contend with this are. And of course, the context of this, this may be kind of quite entry level for people who are interested in the subject matter, but basically we have a very limited amount of carbon that we could emit over the next 80 years. Depending who you ask, it's like between 600 and maybe 1,200 gigatons. But we're spending it so fast already that we're facing a cliff edge in which we're actually going to have to radically change our kind of technological processes. At the same time, huge dilemma, we're looking like we're going to have to build about 2 billion new homes. It's the kind of current projection. It's like global to 2100, which is a lot of construction, a lot of architecture. And what we see this as kind of a central problem that architecture should be kind of grapple with in its logic at this moment in time. There are, of course, no like correct answers or anything, and it's extremely complicated. But one of the things is that we're already part of like a legacy system of committed emissions at this point. And so like all of these questions have to kind of take place within like infrastructures that we're going to kind of be relying on and kind of the plans of countries. And to a certain extent, like the amount of space for us is actually quite limited, and it means that we have to be even more radical. And in the question of decarbonisation, it's tempting to think about like moving from just to green energy as the sort of root major challenge. But actually across lots of industries, deep decarbonisation is this idea that basically every step of the kind of industrial chain is like 1,000 little microprocesses that individually have to be decarbonised. And it's kind of helpful for architecture because we like to think of it as that at this moment, regardless of if this is like central to the design question, we are making these commitments at the same scale of the question of decarbonisation. So architectural systems, material like approaches contain this kind of future commitment to some form of emissions. And so like the changes might be subtle, but scaled up to the systematic level, they're kind of profound. And so we might think of architecture at this moment as like a systems design project. And we pick out this kind of domino house as a kind of diagram of modernism that kind of prefigured how architecture could function in its material program at scale, like 100 years maybe. And it very successful in some ways because it sort of preempts the way we approach mass building right now. But it's kind of that cycle has locked us into one of like reliance on steel, especially cement as like this major global industry. And there's a kind of connection there between the diagram of it as a system and the kind of consequential outcomes at the level of the supply chain. And so this is a kind of really messy space in which we have to kind of operate as architects and kind of pick through. So we come back to this diagram just as a launching off point as like, how do we navigate this point of uncertainty? Like what are the like systems we might come to rely on? So I'm going to hand over to Luke now, and we're going to have a little think about how to unpick this kind of complex way of thinking about uncertainty.
Yeah, so we became very interested in this particular way of mapping uncertainty, which is called a double uncertainty diagram or four-square diagram. Now, the motivation for that is that if we're interested in mapping the project of architecture up to 2050, one of the capacities we need to develop is to be able to occupy and move between multiple different possible futures, both to understand like the difference between them, the sort of path dependencies that might lead to one or the other, but also to kind of be able to hold them in our heads at the same time. And this video shows a medical procedure called a full risk test, a full risk analysis, which is sort of neurological or physical procedure. But we can think by analogy, this is also sort of what we're doing for architecture. We're trying to consider what the potential routes of sort of failure are. So double uncertainty analysis, first time I encountered it, probably for most people, was through the work of this guy, the concept of known unknowns, known knowns, unknown unknowns. Really, a double uncertainty is just an intersection of two different series so as to create this set of four different possibilities. As lots of people have noticed in the case of Rumsfeld, the corner of the diagram he doesn't talk about are the unknown knowns, the things that we don't know that we know, which in many ways are the most interesting and the ones which perhaps we might be interested in this project as well. Double uncertainty analysis was kind of first significantly used in the oil industry in the 1970s. And this is part of this weird historic irony that the first people to develop like really robust forms of knowledge about climate change in many cases were oil companies and the sort of people who are actually responsible for making it happen. The double uncertainty matrix you see on the right here is credited with having helped Shell Oil Company predict the oil price shock of the mid-1970s around the start of that decade. And then double uncertainty has acquired a certain currency more recently, particularly through this book, Four Futures by Peter Fraz, which looks at the possible intersection of the two crises of contemporary capitalism, that of automation, the rise of the robots, and that of climate change, potential catastrophe. So the two axes yield four potential scenarios top left, you've got kind of Mad Max fortress cities for the rich. Bottom left, you've got kind of Silicon Valley hellscape of lawyers. Top right, you've got kind of egalitarian rationing. And bottom right, you've got all the delights of fully automated luxury communism. But the presentation sort of takes a slightly strange turn at this point because of its simplicity, which I think is really its power, the use of these diagrams has become central to a kind of weirdly prolific internet meme culture among people who are interested in futurism. So here we've got potential corona futures, where the axes are minor or post-corona really, minor or earth-shattering changes and kind of light or dark consequences. Here we've got kind of post-collapse scenarios where you could either be living in a nuclear winter wonderland or a sort of solar punk revived society. And these people have even produced one for architecture. This is a really fun one, where the axes are between practical and whimsical solutions and ecological and industrial ones. We should point out that we discovered this one after we did the project, in case it seems to prefigure it in any sort of ways. Maybe to put a pin in Le Guinian fractal cozy localist pueblo, shades of which may appear in some of the later manifestations. But this is also really serious, you know. This, sure, you can use this for this kind of slightly folky, like theory-laden folk art futurism, but this is also used by the IPCC for what are called the shared socioeconomic pathways, which in many cases, you know, I think really are the most consequential scenario analyses being done anywhere in the world at the moment. They talk about not just the sort of possible scenarios for emissions, but the types of geopolitical, economic, material constraints which might lead planetary society to one or the other. So to extremely bad type scenarios far right, or to very livable ones on the left. So from our point of view, what we're interested in here is the question of what the constructive axes could be for a sort of possibility of space of architecture up to 2050. And we sort of divide, the way we've gone about this is to try and single out what these two axes could be. So our double uncertainty works like this. We've got what we're calling a problem axis. What are we solving for? Another way of saying this might be to say, what do we think is going to turn out to be the hard problem? What is going to be what we have to kind of direct design and ingenuity towards solving? And here, this is between energy and materials. And the other one is what we're talking about as agency, which is to say at what scale or what location is the most meaningful sort of intervention going to take place. And between these four, we create four different possible scenarios, sort of scenario extremes. Important to say, though, that these are gradients of relative emphasis. These aren't like either ors or binaries, but rather sort of shades in between modulations. So energy, we know that buildings use a lot of energy. They feature very prominently in diagrams like this one of energy demand. We're entering an era where plausibly energy won't be available cheap and convenient anymore, and we're trying to create infrastructures to monitor, channel, conserve, store it in all sorts of ways. That seems like a very obvious potential future challenge. But it could also be that the material is a bigger challenge, that our bigger problems might be, you know, if green energy is plentiful, perhaps material problems like where they come from, how we make them, whether they can do what we want, whether we have enough of them, what happens to them after they're used over the long period might turn out to be bigger sorts of problems. And so this yields this kind of problem axis of materials to energy, you know. Is CLT a solution, or actually is it the case that we don't have enough trees in the world? It's sort of not really plausible to do all of the things that we want to. These kinds of questions are brought out by the problem axis. Okay, then in terms of agency, obviously we have local solutions, potentially, solutions which are highly specialized, designated by the locale, produced by immediate, by ingenuity with the materials at hand, bespokeness, projects which in the most immediate sense are communal. It might be that that's where meaningful action takes place, or It might be that the intergovernmental level, the sort of structural level, the planetary, the standards, cloud, network, virtualization, big government, big data, big politics, is where the most meaningful agency takes place. So that then yields our agency axis between the local and the systemic. And you can see again where the different sort of forms of intervention and the projects which might be more or less about these particular things start to arrange themselves. So that's our double uncertainty. Which of the four scenarios implied by this has the most salience? And that's what we're going to look at in this project, Deep House. So I'm handing back to Chris to say something quickly about this.
Yeah, so we should just then introduce this as a project. So this is I guess, off the back of this kind of research and thinking about trying to find a way through this for ourselves. And we should say a couple of things about it. I think if we just jump forward a slide, just to be ultra confusing, we actually just flip the axes. So actually we're talking about energy and matter on this side, like left to right, and then on the next top to bottom, it's local to systemic. And what that produces is these four kind of corners of like what we're interested in is the extreme kind of coordination in that direction. So we have, on one hand, we have the first one, progressive house, then ambient house, then we have in the third corner, acid house, and the final one is tech house. And the idea of these is basically these are kind of a sketch of a situation that if we go in this direction as we perceive the solution, what the kind of feeling of that architecture might feel like. And I think it's really important to clarify at this point that we're not really making architectural propositions in maybe a more normal way, which is to say, like, this is an answer to the question. These are to probe what the extreme of that scenario would look like. And so these are not prescriptions or solutions for how we perceive the future. These are, I guess, like whirlpools or vortexes of which we might enter into given certain kind of conditions. And so if we skip forward one more, we find this is a big caveat. Yeah. This was a real project, and it took place in Milan in the middle of February, and it's now currently stuck in the Milan Triennale building, and we don't have access to it because we're sadly stuck in the middle of COVID.
Almost no one has seen it as well.
Yeah, we presented it left, and then the museum shut. So, and the way it was presented originally is as a kind of live introduction, almost like a wargaming strategy exercise of thinking about how these things develop into the corners. Doing this online, this is the complete experiment for us because we haven't really tried this out before. So I hope it makes sense. We're going to go through them. For the keenly observed amongst you, we've actually flipped the axes, but hopefully it will be clear. We should probably skip the slide now.
Okay, so shall I talk about this one? So scenario one is progressive house. Progressive house is, we're calling it like passive house plus 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 plus. It's the extrapolation of a sort of trend within contemporary practice, engineered to deliver energy conservation at the scale of the individual building or dwelling. And its techniques are layering, German engineered precision. It is, at best, it kind of gives you this sort of tranquil and ordered environment, gives you the illusion of this kind of guilt-free heat. It gives you a sense of having discharged your kind of obligations to the wider ecology, but it does that in part by holding all of its externalities, just a little way outside of the quadruple glazed windows. As a global or universal paradigm, the question which is posed by this kind of architecture is it actually feasible to not only build 2 billion of these, but then also in some way to kind of manage their materials in continuing circulation after the end of their plausibly like 25 to 50 year design life? And if not, is that going to destroy the planet? So we're kind of probing possibly the limits considered in a systemic way of this life in a vacuum space bubble architecture. So flipping across the axis, we come to ambient house, which is starts from the position of trying to design entirely with innocuous materials. So it's a sort of strategy of material limitation, everything local, no petrochemical inputs, as simple and fundamental as tectonic as possible, maximum lifespan, and a kind of monumental and long-lived. Where technology and services exist, we talk about a kind of Marie Kondo approach to services, like as little as possible. And then an enormous amount is mediated through the social level and through a certain tolerance of kind of inefficiencies. And its material cycles are handled locally. They're small, they're local, they're leaky, they're dumb, and it doesn't matter very much. This idea that this is a building that you could grind up and throw into the sea and you wouldn't need to feel guilty about it. But the question obviously is this kind of strategy actually viable? Would it even be possible to know whether you're doing decarbonisation or not if your purview is always so incredibly limited to the extremely specific and localised? So then moving across, Chris is going to do the next two.
Yeah, I feel like it's a bit like karaoke or something. But okay, so we have number 3 is like it's acid house, and this is, so we're now in the kind of domain of the systemic. And what we start with in this is like the kind of conversations about how a system might respond to material concerns, which tend to be about like circular economies and this kind of thing. And we're looking at the idea that a launching off point for this is kind of like the Silicon Valley sort of idea of the smart building or profiling of people who use space and applied to the context of architecture in like a very granular way. And you end up with a circular economy that's kind of achieved through essentially like material surveillance and like tracking at all times. And what's kind of interesting about this feature is that maybe everything is provided as a service. So you kind of, everything becomes a component. Architecture actually ends up as a kind of collection of components in space-time. So hence that kind of acid house reference here. And what we see is that the kind of futures that are built into that at the level of the platform kind of get articulated by a very generic, highly standardized architecture. But at the same time, it's kind of a panopticon of BIM that's kind of constantly tracking, constantly assessing the success of the space. And the kind of results of that are that architecture sort of becomes secondary as a design exercise, but as more kind of component organization. And that the kind of domestic occupation of that space is mitigated through kind of like service agreements, warranties, kind of legal infrastructures. And it also begs the really serious question is like, what at this moment in time is the value, or which moment in time should be standardized for the benefit of a circular economy, should we say? Like who, what, and when gets to decide this moment? And do we just take this current moment as the kind of starting point for a kind of deep, global, componentized, like standardized effort? Which takes us to the 4th corner, which is tech house. And I guess this is kind of riffing off a little bit like some of the larger smart city plans, or like something like Sidewalk Labs, with the idea that sort of when you think about the systemic approach focused more towards energy, it kind of takes you off in a direction in which the district or the neighborhood becomes very important and kind of self-isolated. And as a block, you find that it's responding to like large scale infrastructural services that kind of look to protect itself. It also responds to the city as if it's kind of managing or mitigating waste. So it takes waste heat or surplus energy or grey water and uses it in the service of kind of productive allocation for people. We imagine this kind of like a roof structure in which there's a huge modular distribution of kind of green energy components that benefit the people who live inside of it, and they end up living under a kind of roofscape of infrastructure. And one reference point for this might be like the carbon mall, kind of like a retail space beyond like the death of retail. And we're thinking about like in hot climates like Dubai, for instance, where people will go to the shopping mall to kind of escape rising temperatures and feel kind of inward and enclosed. Like, what is this paradigm taken to like the scale of a neighborhood block? And the paradigm of it is that like everything becomes like district heating, district, like maybe even things like district temperature control or district, even like survival mechanism essentially. And the question we might ask in this model is, are we ready for kind of a system which produces a kind of inhuman scale architectural response that kind of relegates the priority of human domestic concerns in service of kind of the regulation of the city? And again, we want to stress a lot that we're not necessarily putting these forward as
not necessarily good. Yeah.
And we're not advocating any of these designs. explicitly, what we're saying is, if we skip forward just to the final kind of summary of this, that what we're interested in is to try and understand the extremes so we can kind of preempt material snags or energy flow problems or kind of systematic level local issues that will, we're trying to avoid a kind of a particular slipstream which might cause us more problems in the future if we're going to radically change things quickly.
I think also, and this goes into the exercise that we're going to be doing in a second, the question becomes, where do we think we are now and where do we want to be? Is the right place to be on this diagram in the middle, or is it closer towards one of the axes? What the invitation for everyone who's currently on the lecture is that we're very shortly going to go into a file in which it will be literally possible for us to start sticking stuff onto the axes. We very much invite you, if you have a project yourself, or in the form of a building, an idea, something you've seen, an element which you're working on, to try to embed that within the axis, and then also think about what the forces are, or what the kind of parallel universe other versions of things are, which might drag them to a different location, what it might take to achieve that. Have we got, is the next slide?
I think it, I think it just should be a link to it's now basically we're opening up this collaborative toolkit file.
Yeah. So
if you go to this web domain, you should link through. I think this, I'll just set up my screen so that we can share the file.
I might, we should just post the links in the chat again. So
and I think if we share, if we go over to sharing my screen, I think.
Okay, I'll stop sharing and I'll put that into the chat now.
What we're anticipating, I guess, is a few moments of like absolute chaos here, which should be quite fun and productive, we hope. I'm just trying to find.
Okay, so if you haven't, just to say again, in case anyone new is here, if you haven't signed up already, you need to sign up for this program in order to be able to edit it. And then there is also a link to the file. I will just post the link to it again so that...
there are 28 people currently viewing this file, which means that it's maybe a few people on the call that aren't accessing it yet. Okay,
so I've just pasted if you're not new to Zoom, the link to open the chat is at the bottom. If you go there, I've just posted into it these two links. First, the one to sign up to Figma, which is the tool, and then second, the one to open this online file. You can open it in your browser. You don't need to download anything, although you can also download the program if you...
Yeah, and we should add that a lot of this is just like straightforwardly editable by anybody. So like, it's not exactly resilient to trolls or anything like that. If you just like, what we're going to suggest is basically, we'll just talk you through the kind of stages and then jump into this kind of shared exercise. So basically...
Should we get people to click on, so if people are in, if they click on Chris's circle at the top right corner, then we could do a little tour that way. Do you want to do that? Or?
There should be a C in the corner with my name on it. And if you click, you can actually see through my screen. I'm also sharing it on Zoom if it's easier. But I'm just going to keep going through now. So basically, what we're asking really is, can you lend us one of your problems, one of your projects, one of your kind of ideas, and maybe have one in mind. And I'll quickly take through the very simple tutorial of how we might add them to this thing. Basically, what you can do is you can copy the component, and there's a lot of components you can copy to mess around with. And generally speaking, where there's text, you can just edit it and you can replace it with your own text. If you copy images from the internet, you can also select the image and just paste it in. So basically, it's very easy to add images, but you just need to make sure that you're selecting by using the command plus click the background. Like there's a kind of sort of curved circle bit on the top. Make sure that you're selecting that bit so you get the right image. And then you can try it out here. Also, like these are just live components. So I'm just going to make another one. I can drag and click and make another one. And I can edit it myself. So it's like test name, etc. And then what we've got is basically like a list of components, people, questions, concepts, materials, and projects. We also got a few references to the kind of mean grids that we had. And what we're trying to do here is then, if we zoom out a bit, go over to this much larger collective map and basically start copying things onto it and basically raising a discussion. And what we're hoping is for the next maybe 5 minutes that people have an attempt at trying to edit this and literally just jump in, copying and pasting and seeing what happens. This is probably 10 times more than the number I've ever had editing a Figma file collectively. So this is uncharted territory for us.
Yeah, it's great. We could also potentially do questions at the same time, or I mean, yes, we could also have that as a kind of soundtrack going in the background. If you're on the file and you find that you have a hand rather than a mouse sort of pointer, and you can't edit anything, that's because you haven't signed up for Figma. So you need to sign up for it. I see a couple of people with that problem. You need to, if you sign up, then you'll be able to edit.
Because this is quite difficult to understand if people are having problems without people.
Yeah. So how are people doing? How are people doing questions? Do they put their hand up in the chat? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, if people can ask questions in the chat, and then I can either bring them up so they can ask them in person, or we can just read them out.
Yeah, okay.
Or you can actually just unmute themselves. I think they can do that.
Ah, possibly.
Yeah, to be honest, it may be okay if people want to unmute themselves and try. We can also ask the questions directly on this board potentially. It may be actually. I think can we go to like a group unmute if we want, because I think if people want to just ask questions, it's not inappropriate. We'll try and keep track of these questions.
Yeah, I can unmute all. Everyone's unmuted now.
Oh, God, chaos. Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hello.
So that's quite difficult.
We see a lot of people like floating around the file. Does it make sense the context of adding like your own projects to this? The fact that we can copy in images and stuff, and we can start adding some more in. We're hoping that basically everyone might add at least one kind of project that they're thinking about.
Yeah. But also, if the intention of this isn't clear, or also if you have a critique, if you think that the axes are wrong, I think that's also potentially. Oh my God!
Okay, yeah,
people are already breaking the format. That's good. That's good.
And we also we've put in some concepts and some technologies, but feel free to just add things that you're interested in.
Yeah, anything can be good.
We can. There's actually. I might start adding some more in.
Okay.
I'm not really sure what's on
You're not sure what we're supposed to be doing? We basically got to paste a project into here.
it is one of them.
Yeah, or like paste projects from the internet. Or even like move materials that are in there.
Oh, you're on
mute? No, I'm on
mute. Everyone's unmuted at the moment, just in case. Just so you know.
I can unmute. I can mute everyone again.
It's okay. It's just no. It's just because sometimes people are embarrassed by. I've been told some funny stories about Zoom meetings which have gone wrong that way. It's. Well, this is looking good. I feel like I'm really perceiving the gestalt at this point.
It is also possible to kind of draw arrows on quite easily with the arrow tool is Shift L. You can draw little arrows. We're kind of interested in how people might imagine where a project is also going. So it's like maybe it's in one place, but it's actually taking us somewhere else.
Where can we draw the arrows?
You should draw them directly onto the map.
Yeah, the shape tools are at the top. If it's the one, if you hold down on the rectangle tool, there are arrows in there.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
And if you have comments or you don't want to use the components we've made, you can also just edit the. You can just write on it if necessary. You can write feedback or write comments.
Okay, I might start putting on some of these. Ah, very nice. Yeah.
I was wondering, should we maybe pass over to some bit of group discussion if there's people who have questions and stuff, because people can kind of keep going, laying stuff out, or maybe people are actively asking some questions on the side. How should we do this next bit? We haven't really, this is the bit we're not, it's slightly untested.
Maybe we could ask people who are adding things to the sheet to kind of talk about what they've added, or maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone feel brave enough to start asking a question or discussing a kind of project and understanding, maybe communicating whether they understand or critique the kind of logic that's been set up? Does anyone feel like they want to jump in here, or are there any questions?
Oh, that's the wrong.
That's it. Okay.
Is there anything in this?
I think people are hard at work still. Don't want to distract people. I guess it's the aim here is to kind of course, like not provide like complete solutions, maybe. So we're kind of curious if people have dealt with some of these issues in their own practice, maybe. For me, the most curious thing is also whether or not people think that their projects are potentially moving in a particular direction. So I wonder if we can call on or ask people specific questions about individual projects, maybe. Or... it's difficult to know. I don't want to interrupt anybody.
It's good. I think
there's a question in the chat now.
Oh yeah.
So Andre.
Okay, so the question is, the first question is, there's lots of pilot projects. How and when will these ideas be adopted into the real world? Which direction do you think is most likely? I might jump into just answering that in terms of just to kind of spitball answer here is, I think for sure, basically, some of the things we've hinted at kind of are best understood at the moment as things that are like pilot projects. So I think like I think there's something like 20,000 passive houses at the moment worldwide, which is something like you could think of a bit of a prototype. The same with kind of Sidewalk Labs or something is very much in like development stage of a kind of new paradigm. In terms of what outcome is most likely, honestly, for me personally, I think there's a kind of elements of all of these which are likely to happen for different reasons. I suppose the question of which is most preferable or most desirable is a really complicated one. I guess at the moment for us, we're trying to open the space of thinking about this so that in the next kind of for future projects, we can build this logic into it. And so I would look at the key questions from this as being like a framework for how to test a project. The one which for me is really important is like, does this material logic scale properly? So one of the questions we've asked ourselves a lot recently is to do with CLT, is like, are there enough forests? Oh, second?
Okay.
Oh, I don't know if that was directed at us.
The function of this projective. Oh, we've got another one. So we've got a comment, and we've got another question.
Sorry, Luke. Hang on.
So, Provisor said that architects are obsessed with working. Once you give them a diagram, they jump into the two-dimensional space and forget reality. Yeah. So maybe we're in the midst of a kind of collective fever dream that why everyone's like super dedicated to making the diagram.
So Andrew has a question saying, like, essentially, what's the function of this? Is this just about preparedness, or is this also moving towards being maybe being a little bit less coy about, oh, this is a narrative, oh, this is the logic of something to its ultimate conclusion? I think that one of the things for me that's really important is that we should be always. I think I always have like a slight issue where a lot of the advice that we're given or seems to be kind of little detached sort of syllogisms, like this, therefore this, and that's just like the rule of thumb that you need to know. I think that what we're trying to argue for here is that really we need to have a much broader kind of systemic literacy, I guess, among designers. That it is useful for us to be able to locate what we're doing and to think about the sorts of assumptions about the future that it depends upon. So it's not necessarily about well, yeah. So I think it's sort of I'm talking myself into a hole here, Chris. But like also I keep seeing new questions coming up.
Okay, just on the question of like projective and sort of speculation versus kind of real world projects, I think is that something that if we like, we obviously want to be speculative about what kind of architecture is possible at this moment, and like I also think that we happen to be in a kind of a moment in which we have to stretch our imaginations to a kind of fairly radical change just in even the next 5 years. So if we look at some of the kind of standards or reports that are being generated right now about best practice, they all kind of include this unknown future uncertainty of like, we're going to, like in 5 years, we're going to have to radically transform this. And so in that model, I think it's preparation for this like big conversation across construction and architecture. but it's also that's actually, it's got a shorter window on it potentially, because we might need to arrive at scalable solutions more quickly and then invest massively in them, either in public kind of infrastructure scale spending or just like by changing the processes. And so it's speculative, but I think that window of what it's trying to speculate onto is actually fairly narrow at this moment.
I think also there is a thing where maybe it would be a good thing for us to be less about what best practice is and maybe more about that systems design, those kind of future designs of material and energy systems as a design project that we should sort of try and be engaged with and kind of critically aware of. I think it could, when we're not necessarily, as Chris says, we're not necessarily advocating for a sort of specific form of response because there are different valid ones.
Yeah, I just wondered, should we try and address some of the other questions?
So we've got another one. So are we looking? So here's one. Are we looking to find a workable model generally for construction? There are elements of all these models which work. Does the polarization of these ideas seek to highlight the strengths, the weaknesses, or both? Yeah, I think that they're. I think it's both, isn't it? I mean, I think it's about trying to highlight the dependencies of these sorts of models on particular types of expectations. And the thing about those expectations is that we're not just passive spectators on the future, but we do have some kind of agency in how, through participation in kind of like social and political life, you know, we are kind of co-creators of what's actually going to happen. And the sort of those kind of entailments are a significant part of how we think about what the most appropriate models are. Did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I also think that in the space of this, in terms of like a workable model, that like the really obvious question that kind of leaps out from this is that like, where does this happen and why? In the sense of that when you like these, if you don't need a single model for the 2 billion houses that we kind of identified as this problem, it may be many different models. I think from my perspective, one of the things it's trying to do a little bit is like loosen the logic as that often takes place in kind of conversations about sustainable architecture, that there may be like a singular solution that is kind of totally valid, and that we should prescribe that very strictly necessarily. And also that a little bit just to explode the question about if this is really, I think, primarily driven by the idea of scale rather than location. But when we think about energy problems in the scale question, that actually like certain new technologies may completely throw up different answers to this. And so, for instance, if the European Union is funding like hydrogen projects to produce steel, the outcome for the building industry is maybe not to shift towards like to radically change its material approach, but to understand how to speed up that process and to change its supply mechanisms to get steel from the right location. That might be hand in hand with other approaches. It's just that we need to be able to kind of quickly communicate these ideas across an industry and understand that they're all available as options. And I think this goes back to this idea of like for ourselves, developing some sense of systems literacy through which we're kind of surfing, because it's quite easy, I think, to develop material practices that kind of operate in isolation and get expert at those things, assuming that they provide the answers. So I think that just to build on that, we've got some more questions. So I think we should jump in.
We've got one. Do we think one of these is the best path, which we work towards it? I mean, I think we said that no, really. I mean, in terms of my view of what the best path is, I think it is about this kind of holistic, systemic context and the ability to, like the guy in the video, continuously be shifting between these potential different futures. I think that there has been perhaps a slight myopia in the way in which we thought about these issues before, where there's been a really sort of unitary focus on energy conservation as being everything that green architecture is about, whereas actually there are a whole series of other systemic entailments which need to be a part of the picture. We've got another question. We referenced the robots, and maybe in response to the ICA's Daily Today, and its epigraph, "A world gained for literary is lost, for technology is lost for liberty. A world gained for technology is lost for liberty." I added Fukuoka as a kind of no-tech approach to this. Do you sometimes worry about the high-tech approach to almost all your questions? Do you want to have a go at that, Chris? And then I think about,
yeah, no, sure. I mean, okay.
How positive are we about technology and its role in these solutions?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I think that I am absolutely personally agnostic to the idea that any technology, like there's no guarantee that any kind of technology is a necessarily positive or negative solution. I think that yes, well, if we think about technology as like a kind of discrete concept that gets added to a map like this, it's very easy just to imagine it's like a binary path between adopting something or not. I think generally speaking, it's so much more messy than that. So we're obviously making this like oversimplifying things. In terms of the actual idea that there may be like a no technology approach, I actually think that like this speaks to the larger question about how we like frame development in the world, and what like of these 2 billion new homes, like housing as a technology itself might not like change that much, and actually how comfortable will we be like not scaling up technology for the sake of kind of commercial gain, but meeting kind of needs of equality and that kind of thing. So absolutely, I think there inevitably will be part of this conversation about the construction of this housing in the future that is about not using technology, or using as little as possible to scale, I think. And so I hope that kind of answers that, at least for me. I don't think that this certainly for me isn't pointing towards like, we've got to use heat pumps, otherwise the house is like wrong or something.
I think for me, as regards to technology, there are various things I would argue for. One is that I think we need a much more materially grounded and a much more kind of historically grounded understanding of technology, that it's not just that there's this kind of transcendent world of the digital, which robots are sort of attached to, which solves everything. I mean, technology also embraces all of the kind of techniques of human civilization from thousands of years ago up to this point. And I mean, yeah, actually, I think I am pretty strong on technological solutions to these questions, but they might be very, very fundamental kind of different ways of making materials, or they might be different ways of integrating material systems around the creation of concrete or steel or whatever into energy systems of producing energy. I think that some of the best prospects actually are looking in a very fundamental way at the deep decarbonization of those kind of industrial processes which underlie, you know, they're like right at the base of the sort of industrial basis of everyday life, and the re-engineering of those things. I do think the big data kind of has a part to play. Like I think that the sort of visualization and trying to understand what's going on is obviously an important part of the project of trying to work out whether we're going in the right direction or not. I don't think that you can really have an understanding of like the reality of global warming without an enormous amount of computing power and data collection attached to it. But I think also that can be overly seductive. Like I feel like we are slightly in a world now of a malaise of enormous amounts of data analysis and not very good data. Like people, you know, there's a kind of seduction of trying to graph everything, but without necessarily being able to, you know.
I'm just going to add to that, because I think something that might be worth, for me, the value of this kind of exercise is that if you kind of go to, I happen to have gone to like quite a few conferences about stuff like smart buildings or smart city stuff, and it's kind of usually outside the realm, like a policy level of where architecture kind of gets near. But if you hear the kind of propositions that are being put forward for the like construction industry or architecture generally, I think like the debate in architecture is sort of siloed against other disciplines at the moment. And I think that in a strange way, it's not necessarily that the technology of, say, a big data technology is particularly functional or useful in this process, but there are lots of people in the world right now who think that it is, and are aggressively pushing this stuff into this domain. And they're actually people from kind of potentially non-traditionally construction or architecture-based backgrounds who see this as a kind of a project space in which to operate. And from my perspective on this, I think that we just have to kind of broaden the conversation to be inclusive of those kind of forces, because if we don't listen to people who are proposing smart cities at a governmental level and know how to operate alongside that, or even kind of industrial technologies that apply things on the supply chain, we're very quickly, as designers, going to be kind of relegated to the kind of filling in the gaps below. And and obviously people have a lot of opposition to some of those things in terms of like smart cities already, but like how to mobilize that or include that in the conversation of architecture is maybe what this is about, I think, on one hand.
There's a good question here. Well, really, it's a kind of an observation making the point that a lot of this is more about public policy questions than it is about the architectural scale of agency, which I think I broadly sign up to. I think I'd make the comment that, yeah, architecture does need to be more conversant in and kind of participate maybe more critically in those sorts of discourses. I think we need to really think about the design of standards, for example, as like this critically important design exercise. Like in the last few years, all of the standards for what BIM is, for example, have been kind of produced, this enormously consequential thing, and very few people really seem to have been aware of it until it became like an actual requirement of their job that they have to meet these various things.
In some of the standardization at the urban level, like the International Standard Organization, ISO, has actually got full standards for like smart city data kind of and sustainable or resilient cities. And it actually, they sort of don't get that much coverage in this, but a lot of these international organizations have kind of run away with making international standards, both for data, but also kind of public policy. And they're happening in a really different realm, I think, at this moment in time.
Yeah, they're designing the buildings for us. Do you think that building or designing evidence bases is what can make shifts to these futures more possible? Yeah, I think some of these questions are covering similar terrain in a way. Maybe, okay, so then we've got a question: how does enforcement come into play in these scenarios? Do you have a feeling about the necessity of enforcement? Yeah. What do you think, Chris? I mean, I think the sort of geopolitics of all of this is like a whole different exercise. Yeah. And if anyone can predict what kind of geopolitical world we're going to be living in 5 years, congratulations to them.
Yeah, because I think this is really one of the tensions at the heart of this question about decarbonization generally, is that it is obviously geopolitical, and the uncertainty of the future of our politics is really hard to grapple with. And I think, like, maybe the question about enforcement is how much enforcement we might be comfortable with or even argue for as like designers, and how, like, what the limitations of that should be. Because I think if we look at this kind of conversations around Part L and the recent work by Letty, there's like a real desire, I think, within the industry to actually kind of get pushing the government to act and adopt sort of enforcement in new regulations, and that seems very positive actually in the context of these conversations, because the question might be more like, will the government be capable of enforcing it? Like maybe the design industries kind of get there first and are kind of more organized because they can be. I don't know.
Yeah. A couple of points about big data at the bottom. I mean, I think worth saying, everyone will have noticed that there's been a complete recasting of the kind of concept of like surveillance in the age of Corona, like this thing which for a very long time has been pretty straightforwardly indicted as being central to how contemporary capitalist societies kind of regulate and exert authority over people, now seems to, biopolitics is a lot more ambiguous in the era of the epidemic. There is a question about renovations as well. How will these reflect renovations with current speed of building, as there may not be anywhere to use these in the future? So I guess that's particularly about a British context in which, I mean, I think that's the other thing, isn't it? That I find myself a little bit frustrated often to see it in guidance about well, we need to be aiming for this or that standard, when by far the most consequential issue with regard to the actual energy and use of buildings is to do with the ones which already exist and will probably still exist in 2050. I mean, the house which I'm in, I guess, was built in the 1910s, and I think it will probably still exist in 2050, and its energy performance really depends. I mean, I think a lot of these houses are slightly holding out for a sort of technological deus ex machina from that point of view, because it's not clear that people are really up for the scale of fabric intervention which would be required to turn this into a passive house.
And also, just to add, I think maybe the ultimate straw man that we've kind of put forward here in terms of this as an exercise is that the assumption is about this kind of global demand of housing. It could be that the central kind of organized response to the issue of the climate crisis for the built environment is to stop building. And I think we should take that seriously. It's, from my perspective, I think very hard to imagine at this moment, without massive, quick government intervention, the idea that the construction industry and the architecture industry and all the services connected to it are paused or kind of go into a moment of hibernation, except for the fact that it's happening now. So the imagination has shifted. But as in, I heard this came out, someone said this at Future Build, I think, on a panel about this, which was something like, if we all just agreed to stop building right now, these problems would get much easier to solve. There's a kind of question there about what, how we might collectively agree to do that. And if we just shifted all our attention to retrofit for now, we might arrive at a kind of much different answer. So I think that is a very valid question.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. But then we are also, I guess it's a bit grandiose, but we are trying to advance this as being a project which is about a larger context as well, that this does have some salience thought about in a international context. We've got another question. Are you happy to keep going? We've got some questions about these kind of infrastructural processes and their susceptibility to problems to do with complexity. So how this kind of metric of complexity also comes into this compass that we're creating. Is maybe a little bit long to read the whole thing out, but I think particularly with reference to sort of public policy, there does seem to be a bit of an issue with how extremely complex systems are dealt with by maybe the slightly limited political means at hand. I think definitely in some ways the energy matter axis is one which has more complexity at one end than the other. No, the project of deep decarbonisation of industry is a multiplicity, and the project of decarbonisation of energy seems to be one big thing. Also, the latter seems to have a much more extended temporality. It seems to be about creation of these long cycles which keep on developing and have to keep adjusting over time, whereas energy in a way is just about maintaining a constant running level. In a way, it has sort of neither a future nor a past, except measured against the index of CO2 emission. And
we might just, because I think the question is also ranking them against resistance to complexity. I think this is a really interesting question. I would say implicitly, I think this kind of ambient house is the one which tries to escape complexity in its simplest form, I think, because it's it's sort of opting out a little bit. It's more off-grid. It's the kind of idea that you don't have to be part of a infrastructural mega system in some sense, even though we kind of all automatically are with the internet and electricity grids. And I think that it may be that they kind of propose different responses to complexity. So if we think about the kind of acid house model of this ultimate smart home complexity thing, the complexity in that issue is really that the system doesn't meet up to reality, and that actually what you find most of the time is that the system is perfectly designed to counteract complexity and deal with this thing, deal with the kind of issues at hand. And then when you get onto the ground, the light switch doesn't work, or even worse, the system doesn't look anything like the model imagines it does. I think at the other end of the spectrum, because we are thinking systemically, they kind of immediately pushes the idea of complexity, as Luke was saying, towards like higher authorities. And so the structure of dealing with the complexity is to kind of make the trade-off towards a kind of political unity around these things. I don't know if it's easy to rank the other two. I guess the tech house idea is the most complicated because requires the most complexity to change. So it's probably very fallible, and we all kind of live inside complex, maybe broken infrastructures, but I don't know.
Yeah, you kind of move complexity around in any of these systems. Sometimes it's inside the design, sometimes it's outside of it. I don't know. I think I need to spend a bit more time thinking about that one. We might be getting to the end. Do you think we're...
Yeah, should we wrap up?
We can wrap up,
or
yeah.
If anyone has any questions, but...
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Pravas. Can I quickly say add something?
Yeah.
So like Chris mentioned a word preemption, and I think that's a very interesting word for me because, for example, so how Malik have written a book on time complexity, and then basically he's saying if you want to preempt something, you need like past data so then you can predict the future. But actually, you're not changing the future; you're changing the present according to the prediction of the future. So in terms of this diagram, if there's no time axis, then there's no preemption. Like, do you
yeah, no, it's a lack of time axis, I guess. I mean, in a strange way, I guess we thought that the graph was probably going to be complicated enough. In my mind, I guess I imagine that it's kind of the time axis is like popping out into us in like a kind of third axis towards us, I guess. But yeah, in terms of preemption or like what it's based on, or what I guess this is taking the kind of current cultural moment of now and the kind of like shared zeitgeist about what these things mean or represent in terms of their like cultural position or how they are introduced into kind of discourse, rather than like a kind of systematic or technical assessment on the viability of them, which I think as soon as you could introduce very easily like a time axis for some of these technologies. For instance, like if say electric vehicles as part of this, like there's kind of a well-known future projection of how fast they can scale and what the policy architecture for that is at a kind of continental level, say. And I think we could introduce that and we could make a kind of time axis of this. I think the question is that A, that's kind of complicated, and B, I think because it crystallizes the fact that some of these things may be more baked in than others, it actually, this would obviously help us narrow the range of possibility, kind of the space. But while we're trying to expand it, it's kind of good to include, from my perspective, like the different kind of far extremes that are very much harder to test or have a kind of history or logic to. But yeah, I think that obviously kind of next step would to have a kind of much more detailed, critical, like the ability to take things off this and say that they're not like, that's actually kind of irrelevant or need to be highlighted. Luke, you got?
No, I'm all used up.
Yeah. Any more questions? Because I feel like maybe we should reflect on the graph a little bit. It looks absolutely incredible.
It's amazing. This has worked much better than I was even hoping. It really it's going to take a little bit of sort of hermeneutics to understand what's being proposed. Maybe we should do a debrief at some point where we try and understand what the conclusions have been.
we could do another one of these in like a few weeks or so. Maybe everyone can come back and we can.
Yeah. We could do.
I thought you were going to say like at 2030 we'll all meet again. Like.
Yeah. If you've got, I mean, if people do have other questions, we're on Twitter and Instagram. We're _heat_island, I think, on both. Is that right, Chris?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, you can always message us there if you want to ask anything. But thanks so much for coming. Really, really appreciate everyone for joining in. Really, that was really fun for us.
Great. I'll just unmute everyone so you can all say thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Nice to meet everyone digitally.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers, guys.